Welcome to Governance Edge, where we explore emerging trends shaping board oversight and governance. I'm Jenn Cox, Executive Director for the NACD Texas TriCities chapter, and today I'm joined by Malcolm Adkins, Managing Director at Pearl Meyer, where he advises boards and companies on executive and director compensation. Malcolm, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Jen. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you with us. So today we're talking about director compensation and specifically several trends that were highlighted in the NACD 2025-2026 Director Compensation Report, which was created in partnership with Pearl Meyer. So let's jump right in. So according to the report, we've seen a shift towards shorter vesting periods and in some cases, even immediate vesting for director equity. Malcolm, what's driving that evolution, and when should boards be considering adjusting their vesting structure?
Yeah, so these changes in vesting, they're really driven by one core question. Why does director equity exist in the first place? For executives, equity is often about retention and incentives, but for directors, it's different. It's really just about alignment. Directors are there to represent shareholders, so the goal is for them to experience the gains and the losses the same way investors do. That shift in philosophy is driving a move towards shorter vesting periods, as you mentioned. Today, about 70% of companies use 1 year vesting for full value shares. And we're also seeing a meaningful increase in immediate vesting, particularly when we look at the largest companies in our sample. It may sound counterintuitive, but it's actually strengthening independence. Directors aren't tied to the board by unvested equity, and it avoids any perception that compensation is influencing tenure. And in many cases, companies pair immediate vesting with deferred settlement. So directors still hold equity over time, but without the retention mechanics. So overall, the trend is towards equity structures that are simpler, aligned with annual board service, and reinforce independence rather than retention.
Yeah, makes sense. So, following the idea of simplification, it seems to show up in other ways as well. The report points to a continued simplification of director compensation structures, kind of a less is more approach. Why are
Mhm.
boards moving in that direction, and what does simplification look like in practice?
Yeah, so when we look at director compensation trends, we really have to take a step back and look at these things over a 5 to 10 year period. Things happen very, very slowly. But this is one of the clearest themes that we see in the data, and it shows up in three areas. The first one is meeting fees have largely gone away. Prevalence has been declining for years, and only a small percentage of companies still use them. Most boards recognize that just per meeting pay is adding complexity where it's not needed. So there are still situations where it can make sense, like when workload is unpredictable, but those are sort of becoming the exception. Second, we're seeing less emphasis on committee member retainers. When we first started to see meeting fees decline, it was in favor of these committee member retainers. But now, especially when we look at larger companies, more of that's just being folded into a single board retainer while still maintaining additional pay for committee chairs. And third, there's been a clear shift in equity vehicles. Stock options are now very rare and full value shares dominate. The issue with options is they kind of introduce volatility and can blur the line between oversight and management incentives, whereas full value shares are just simpler and better aligned with governance objectives. So, when you put all that together, boards are moving towards fewer pay components, more predictable structures, and programs that are easier to explain to both directors and shareholders.
Yeah, it seems like, especially with the committee pay, that with more and more meetings being required, that just it makes more sense to simplify that into a overall retainer. There was another notable finding in the changing mix between cash and equity. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, at a really high level, it's coming down, the mix is coming down to alignment and expectations. Equity now represents roughly 60% of total director compensation. But what's really interesting is it's consistent no matter what company size we look at. And it's just been gradually increasing over time. There's always been the long-standing governance principles that recommend a meaningful portion of director be equity-based. But what's really driving it now is the broader environment. Directors are taking on more responsibility, whether it's, technology or cybersecurity or human capital issues, and there's just more scrutiny than ever from shareholders. So equity just reinforces a focus on long-term value creation, and it sends a clear signal that directors' interests are aligned with investors. So I don't want to call 60/40 a hard rule, but it's definitely increasingly becoming a market norm.
Right. So when you put those trends together, shorter vesting, simpler structures, more equity, they seem to reflect a broader philosophy. What do these shifts tell us about how boards are redefining director pay today?
Yeah, I think if we just take a step back and we look at everything, all these trends together, what they really point to is a shift towards more thoughtful design. So, director compensation isn't about big swings in pay, it's about getting the structure right. Boards are simplifying programs, they're relying more heavily on equity, and they're structuring that equity in a way that reinforces independence and alignment. And that's really a response to the environment boards are operating in today. Expectations are higher than ever, responsibilities are broader, and compensation is just evolving to support that role. So, what these trends are signaling is a move towards more focused and governance driven compensation design.
Right. And as boards revisit director compensation, what governance principles should they keep front and center to make sure that they're being thoughtful, defensible, and obviously aligned with shareholder expectations?
That's a great question. I think we can really boil it down to three principles that boards should keep in mind. And we've talked about them a little bit here. The first is alignment. Director compensation needs to clearly align directors and shareholders, and that's where equity plays such a critical role. The second one is independence. You just want to make sure the structure doesn't create any unintended incentives or even the appearance that compensation could influence a director's judgment or tenure. And third is just simplicity and transparency. The program should be easy to understand, easy to explain, and ultimately it should be defensible to shareholders and proxy advisors. So when boards keep these principles in focus, it just helps ensure the program supports good governance rather than creating unnecessary complexity or risk.
So, where do boards most often get this wrong?
Yeah, so where I tend to see challenges is when director compensation starts to align too closely with the same objectives we see in executive compensation. Because at that point, you're just blurring the line between oversight and management, which can undermine the board's independence. So we also see some issues when elements are just added over time without really taking a step back when you do that and looking at the structure as a whole. So when you do that, the program to just become harder to explain, and in some cases, it can even become hard to defend. So I think we always need to take a holistic view and be willing to simplify, and we often see that's where boards can improve.
Yeah, big fan of simplicity. So, for directors and governance leaders who are watching today, what is the one piece of advice that you would leave them with as they evaluate their own director compensation structure and whether it's still fit for purpose?
Yeah, I'd say the most important question to ask is this. Does your compensation structure still reflect the role that the board is actually playing today? We mentioned board responsibilities have expanded significantly over time, and compensation should just evolve alongside that. So it's not just about benchmarking or keeping up with the market. It's about making sure your program is aligned with your company's complexity, your board's workload, and the expectations of your shareholders. And I think if those elements are all aligned, then your program is likely to fit for purpose.
Malcolm, thank you so much. This has been a very insightful discussion on an issue that continues to evolve alongside the demands of board service. So we really appreciate you sharing your insight with us. And thank you all who are watching for joining us today for Governance Edge. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Jenn.